Hi, everyone, and welcome to Oak Ridge Student Ministries Sunday morning lesson. I'm so glad you can join us today. We're actually in the middle of a series called Big Picture. So this is week 4 of our Big Picture series. If you haven't checked out the first 3 weeks, just go back and take a look. We have a playlist of youth videos, and Big Picture, the previous 3 weeks, we'll cover more of it. But we've been talking about the life of a pretty important guy in the Old Testament by the name of Joseph. And we'll get into more on him later. But what you need to know is this: his story is crazy. And I don't mean a little bit weird. I mean like straight out wild. He found himself in the middle of some pretty unbelievable, difficult, and even scary circumstances. And while we all get the privilege of knowing how amazing Joseph's story ended up at the time, he certainly didn't see the bigger picture. All he could see was what was happening right in front of him, then and there. Now, I have to wonder if being in the middle of all those crazy and painful circumstances made Joseph ask a question I think a lot of us ask when we find ourselves in similar situations. And that is, what's the point? I mean, honestly, haven't we all been there? You go through a situation in your life that you don't understand, or find yourself in a circumstance that you don't want to be in, or you're disappointed with the way your life looks, and you think, what's the point of all this? Why do I have to go through this? Why does it have to be this way? And for me, I had a similar experience. I was in grade 9, and we had a guidance counselor who came into our class, and she was asking the class of about 30 grade 9 students what we wanted to be when we grew up, and trying to tell us that the most important choices we were going to make were what classes we were going to take in grade 10, because that would determine whether we were going an academic or at the time it was applied, kind of geared towards going out and working, or college or university, depending on. And at the time, I was a very quiet individual. I was shy. I was not the person you know now. And I put my hand up, and I looked at this guidance counselor, and I said, "Excuse me, but do you know what you're having for dinner tonight?" And she said, "Well, no." And my response was, "Well, then how do you expect us to know what we're going to do in 5 years, at least, in 10 years or more?" And it was this moment when I went, what's the point? What's the point of focusing so hard on what's going to come? And maybe you haven't had an experience exactly like mine, but a lot of you have probably felt this way too, this what's the point sentiment. Maybe for you, it was at school. And you've thought, why do I need to learn about things like the French Revolution in history class, or the periodic table in science, or long division in math? When am I ever going to need this in life? What's the point? Or maybe you felt this way at home. Your parents make you do chores, or play with your siblings, or wake up early on a Saturday morning, and you absolutely don't understand why. Every time you're picking your clothes up off the floor, or taking your sister outside, or being forced to get up early on a weekend, you think, what's the point? Maybe you've asked this question when you found yourself dealing with disappointment, when you didn't make the team, or were ghosted by a friend, or were gossiped about at school. You just couldn't understand why you had to deal with the pain and disappointment of it. You couldn't see the bigger picture, the point of the situation. Or maybe it was something really, truly painful. Maybe you've watched a loved one struggle through an illness. Maybe they've even passed away. Or maybe you've dealt with things like anxiety or depression. And no matter what you do, you can't seem to shake it. Maybe your parents are going through a divorce. Or you've been placed in foster care. Or someone close to you hurt you in a way you don't know how to come back from. Those things certainly make you wonder, what's the point in all of this? Maybe you've even felt this way about your faith. You come to church, you crack open the Bible from time to time, you say a few prayers here and there, but nothing really feels any different. You keep trying to connect with God, but nothing seems to happen. And so you're left wondering, what's the point? Well, the truth is, we'll all experience difficult things throughout our lives. And when we're in the middle of those difficult things, we often ask the same question: what's the point? We don't see any good in the situation, or we don't experience the outcome we hope for. And we don't see any part of the bigger picture. We just see our pain. When we feel that way, it's nearly impossible to believe that anything good can come from it, isn't it? Well, that brings us right back to Joseph. His life is recorded in the Old Testament. And remember last week how we said that Joseph found himself in the middle of a lot of difficult situations, painful, frustrating circumstances. Well, after his own brothers threw him in a well, and Joseph was sold into slavery, he was taken into Egypt to work for a guy named Potiphar. And just as things were starting to look up for Joseph, he was put into another difficult situation. He was falsely accused of something he didn't do and thrown into prison as a punishment. Talk about unfair. Can you imagine how Joseph must have felt sitting there in prison? I know what I'd be thinking. It would be something like, God, you've got to be kidding. I mean, could things get any worse for me? How long is this terrible time going to last? What's the point of any of this? Now, I think these are definitely all fair questions for Joseph to have asked. He tried so hard to do the right thing over and over again. He tried to remain faithful to God. And where it had gotten him? Into jail. If I were Joseph, I'd definitely have a hard time seeing the bigger picture. But thankfully, God always had the bigger picture in mind. What Joseph couldn't see as he sat in prison was that God was working behind the scenes to help him. He was working for good, even in Joseph's pain. Joseph just couldn't see it yet. You see, while Joseph was in prison, he wasn't alone. Two important guys in the Pharaoh's household, his cupbearer and his baker, both got thrown in there with Joseph for a little while. You could probably guess the role of the baker in the Pharaoh's household, but the cupbearer? That's not a role we hear about often in our current day. Basically, the Pharaoh's cupbearer was a trusted person who served him drinks and made sure it wasn't poison. Kind of a risky position. Now back to our story. What Joseph didn't know was that these two guys, the cupbearer and the baker, were going to play a much bigger role in his story. Take a look at what happened in Genesis 40, verses 5 to 8. While they were in prison, Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker each had a dream one night, and each dream had its own meaning. When Joseph saw them the next morning, he noticed that they both looked upset. "Why do you look so worried today?" he asked them. And they replied, "We both had dreams last night, but no one can tell us what they mean." At first glance, this doesn't seem all that remarkable of a story. Two guys had a couple of weird dreams. That's not that important, right? Wrong. You see, at the time, dreams were believed to be predictions of what might actually happen in the future. So often, when people had weird dreams, they would seek out someone to help them figure out the meaning so they could understand what was to come in the future. And well, Joseph knew that God could help him interpret dreams. So he told the cupbearer and the baker just that. Then Joseph listened to their dreams and interpreted them as God showed him what they meant. Joseph told the cupbearer that his dream meant that Pharaoh was going to restore him to his position in 3 days. Great news. Then Joseph predicted that the baker's dream meant that in 3 days the Pharaoh was going to execute him. Not great news. I'd much rather be in the cupbearer scenario, wouldn't you? Either way, after Joseph helped these two guys understand their dreams, he had just one request for the cupbearer. When he got restored to his position with Pharaoh, he'd mention Joseph and help him get out of prison. Let's take a look at what happens next in Genesis chapter 40, verses 20 to 23. Pharaoh's birthday came 3 days later, and he prepared a banquet for all his officials and staff. He summoned his chief cupbearer and chief baker to join the other officials. He then restored the chief cupbearer to his former position so he could again hand Pharaoh his cup. But Pharaoh impaled the chief baker, just as Joseph had predicted when he interpreted his dream. Pharaoh's chief cupbearer, however, forgot all about Joseph, never giving him another thought. Okay, I think there are two important things to note about this passage. First, everything God told Joseph would happen did. And second, even after all that, Joseph was still forgotten. The cupbearer didn't keep his word, and so Joseph remained in prison. Can you imagine how hopeless Joseph must have felt after that? He probably thought that was his last chance to be released from prison, and we can only assume that again he found himself asking, what's the point of all this pain and suffering? Nothing is ever going to change. And for a while, that probably seemed true, because as the Bible tells us, it took a full 2 years for the cupbearer to finally remember Joseph. But Joseph didn't know all that was happening, all that God was doing in those years. He couldn't yet see the bigger picture. And can you really blame Joseph for probably feeling down in his situation? Can you blame him for not paying attention to the bigger picture that God was creating? He was in prison for 2 whole years. That's an incredibly long time to have been wondering what God was up to. Well, that was the situation Joseph was in. But 2 years later, the Pharaoh himself had a dream that no one could interpret. It was then that the cupbearer finally remembered a guy he met in prison who had interpreted his own dream. And just like that, things turned around for Joseph. He got his chance. The Pharaoh called on him to interpret his dream, and God helped Joseph do just that. Let's take a look at what happened after that in Genesis 41, verses 39 to 40. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has revealed the meaning of the dream to you, clearly no one else is as intelligent or wise as you are. You will be in charge of my court, and all my people will take orders from you. Only I, sitting on my throne, will have a rank higher than yours." Finally, after all the struggle and suffering, after slavery, imprisonment, abandonment, Joseph finally got the good news that seemed like it would change his life for the better. It was about time. But here's the thing. This isn't about Joseph finally getting good news. This isn't about the happy ending or the nice promotion Joseph got. It's about the bigger picture. What Joseph didn't realize during that time in prison was that God was writing the bigger story. Joseph didn't see that right there in the middle of a painful and difficult circumstance, he was positioned to do something great, something only he could do. Joseph's story was painful and filled with problems. But through those problems, God was creating a better future for Joseph. Joseph just had to be willing to trust that God could use him right where he was. That even during Joseph's pain and problems, God was working behind the scenes for his good. And I think the same can be true for us. We may never understand why we're dealing with the things we're dealing with, or why we're facing our circumstances. But we can trust that just like God was there for Joseph, there's a bigger picture for us. And while creating a bigger picture, God is working for our good. That good may not always look the way we think it will. It certainly didn't for Joseph. And we may never actually figure out why we had to go through the tough things that we went through. But when we trust God right where we are, we can trust that He's working towards what's best for us, even if we can't see it or don't understand it. In other words, when you can't see the bigger picture, trust that God is working for your good. So, how do we do that? Instead of struggling to find the point in our pain, how do we trust that God is working for our good? I think we can start with these 3 steps. 1, exercise faith. On a daily basis, or maybe even an hourly basis, choose to believe and trust that God is good and that He has everything in His control. In those moments when you don't feel like you believe, or when the pain is too much, say something like this, over and over until you start to believe it. God, you are good no matter what, and you have everything in your control. Secondly, look for the good. While you're in a difficult situation, it's normal to want to rush past the problem, but sometimes you need to pause and take a step back. You can learn something about yourself and others when you do. Sometimes you can grow in the process. And while you won't always see the ways in which God is working for your good, you can still make a choice to look for it. And you can look back on the times when God worked for your good in the past, even when you didn't realize it at the time. And thirdly, seek encouragement. When you lose sight of the truth that God is working for your good, lean into someone else. Ask them to tell you a story of when God was working for their good, even when they couldn't see the bigger picture. Use their experience to encourage you during your difficult times. So remember, when you can't see the bigger picture, trust that God is working for you. Thanks, everybody, and have an awesome week.